I'm here to talk about a study we did on the costs of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, with a focus on school and work in the United States. Next slide, please. Let me just start by acknowledging my co-authors, in particular the lead author, Jalpa Doshi of the University of Pennsylvania, and other co-authors whose names you see here. This study was funded by Shire. There was no restrictions on the content of this presentation. Next slide, please. So typically we look at impairment in diseases by clinical manifestations. There's clinically significant impairment in functioning, for example, with ADHD. In this study, we were interested in impairments in other sectors, social, academic, occupational sectors, in multiple settings across children and adults, and approaching this from a health economics perspective. So in a sense, we're trying to monetize the impairment across different sectors with a focus on school and work. If you look at the total burden, and I'll focus in a moment on the school and work component, the total burden, we came up with an estimate of 140 to $266 billion in 2010 US dollars. Next slide, please. What I'll focus on in my brief remarks today are the costs of, annual costs of illness and ADHD in the US, focusing again on school and work. So essentially we did a systematic literature review of primary studies from 1990 through June of 2011, focusing on studies in the literature that had looked at education and work-related costs. The search strategy is somewhat complex. It's essentially a Medline search with search terms. You do broad searches, came up actually with 4,500 studies, and then through strict inclusion-exclusion criteria, narrowed it down to just a relatively few studies that we viewed as worthy of more analysis. We think this is new and important for three reasons. One, we believe it's the most comprehensive economic analysis of the costs of ADHD in children and adults across sectors, in particular school and work, number one. Number two, we believe this is more rigorous than previous studies of this kind in terms of strict inclusion-exclusion criteria and a focus only on studies that had used matched controls. So we're trying to understand the cost of ADHD above others, controlling for factors such as age and where possible comorbidities. And finally, we aggregated per person costs up to national estimates. Next slide, please. So here are the results. Let me just orient you. If you start on the left, you're seeing basically two circles, an inner circle, which is what we call a low-range estimate, and an outer circle, which is a high-range estimate. The reason for the ranges is different studies in the literature use different methodologies and come up with different conclusions. But we're finding a range in terms of educational costs of $15 to $25 billion per year. Those are costs associated with special ed, special services such as speech therapy, counseling, disciplinary incidents, and so forth. And you can see the breakdown by different age groups. On the right, you see productivity costs, ranges of $86 to $138 billion, and those costs are driven by what we call presentism, poor performance at work, absenteeism, disability, workman's comp, and income losses. Now those are costs in adults with ADHD, again, compared to matched controls. So just finally, some key takeaways here. The magnitudes of estimates do vary widely. But we're estimating the incremental cost of ADHD in these two sectors at $101 to $163 billion a year in 2010. The analysis indicates that ADHD is associated with a substantial individual and societal economic impact. Now, the key drivers are these work-related costs, particularly income losses due to lower wages and unemployment, and education-related costs, for example, special education classes. So the results indicate a need for policies that look at these broad costs. And if you're doing cost-effectiveness analyses, for example, as my colleagues and I often do, important to look not only at medical costs, but at these other costs. There are certainly caveats in doing this kind of research. I'm happy to come back to them in Q&A. There's uncertainty, there are gaps, there's room for more study. We tried very hard to be conservative. And when you do estimates like this, you get ranges in the 100, $50 million a year estimate. So thank you very much.